Right guys, welcome to RC Mojo and the next bag in the XV-01 build. This time it's the electronics and the bits to get it rolling, so here we go. Step 27, Servo Saver. First job is to center the servo. If you have a servo tester, use that. Otherwise, grab your receiver and plug the servo into the steering channel. Plug your ESC into the throttle channel, make sure it's switched off and plug in the battery. Turn on your transmitter, make sure all the trims are set to neutral and turn on the ESC. Assuming the radio is bound, the servo will center itself. If nothing happens, check the manual for your radio. Grab part Q4 or Q5 from the Servo Saver parts tree. I'm using Q4 as this servo has a Futaba spline. Pop it on the servo with the spring retainer as close to the bottom with the servo in the position in the diagram. It may be slightly off, but don't worry too much, just find the best position. You can now turn off the ESC and transmitter and unplug all the parts. From the Servo Saver tree you need to find Q3, the spring, and Q1, the spacer. You'll also need JJ10 off the JJ tree, as this build doesn't use the arm from the Servo Saver tree. Open up bag E and put the screws in a pot. You'll need a ball end and one of 4 screws. Look at the screw that came with your servo to hold on an arm and choose the screw that's the best match. Usually the machine screws are for metal gear servos and the self-tappers for plastic gears. Start by fitting the ball end onto the Servo Saver arm. You want to put it in from the side with the spring retainer. When it's nice and snug, pop a dust cover over the top. This can be a bit of a pain. You need to pop the plastic spring over the Servo Saver base. Something like a flat-bladed screwdriver is useful to spread the end so you can press it on. When you do manage it though, just pop the arm over the top, fit the Q1 spacer and drop in the chosen screw and do it up. Step 28. Fitting the servo. And before we get into it, it's a good time to stick the bit of foam tape on the chassis. Size it up on the chassis, give it a snip, peel the backing off and stick it in. Job done. Right. We'll be needing 2 8mm countersunk screws, 4 8mm or 4 10mm screws depending on the use of shims, more on that in a minute, 4 washers, 2 NN29s, the servo mounts, and a pair of ball cups and the last turnbuckle, which I'm sure by now you know the drill for, thus here's one I made earlier. So, the thing with standard servos is they're not quite all the same. The important bit here is the mounting lugs can be at slightly different heights relative to the output spline. Since the servo mounts aren't adjustable, Tamiya supplied 2 different thicknesses of shims so you can get it just right. This particular servo, a Fitech FT5679M, has its lugs quite low on the servo, so it mounts up with the Servo Saver just touching the foam without any shimming. So I'm using the shorter 8mm screws. If you end up with loads of clearance for the Servo Saver, or the bottom of the servo doesn't quite fit in the tray, you can experiment with the shims and the longer 10mm screws. So, with the mounts mounted to the servo, remembering to put a washer under the screw heads, offer it up to the chassis and see how well it fits. If it all looks good, flip the chassis over and pop in the 2 countersunk screws. Do them up so they're just snug, there's no need to go silly. Flip the chassis back up the right way, pop the turnbuckle over the ball end on the bell crank and the servo arm. And there we have it. The angle on the linkage is a bit strange, but I reckon it will work just fine. Step 29. And you may need to get a bit creative on this one. Grab your ESC of choice. Here we're just using a budget Model Sport one. Just about any brushed ESC will do the job with the stock motor. Pop it in towards the back of the electronics bay, plug the motor in and check to see if the leads will actually reach. If they don't, you'll have to do a bit of trial and error, but in our case they'll just about reach. So cut a strip of the servo tape and stick it to the bottom of the ESC, and another bit on the receiver. Stick the ESC in, making sure it's positioned so everything will reach, and that the battery connector is put through into the battery bay. Then plug the servo and ESC into the receiver and stick it in. Tuck all the servo leads away so they don't flap about. Use another bit of servo tape on the switch, and assuming it will reach, stick it on top of the servo. Step 30. The electronics cover. Right, some parts. From the JJ tree we need a number 4, an antenna mount, a number 5, a blanking plate. From the L tree we need number 2, the cover, number 6, the small lid, and number 7, the big lid. For screws we need 8 8mm, 1 black 8mm countersunk, 1 6mm countersunk, and 3 small self-tappers. We'll start by fitting the smaller lid onto the cover. It attaches with 4 8mm screws from the underside. So we'll have to do that first, or we won't be able to get at it. Unfortunately, I didn't check to see if what I was doing was actually in frame, so bear with me. Line the cover up over the electronics, being very careful not to trap any wires. There's a small recess up at the servo end for the wires that come out of the box. When you're happy, pop the last 4 8mm screws in and do them up, and do a final check for any escapees. Grab the antenna mount and pop it into one of the matching holes on top of the battery box. If you're running 2.5 gig with a short antenna, use the hole near the electronics. If you're on 27 or 40 meg, use the far one as per the manual. It's fixed in place with the black 8mm countersunk screw from the underside of the battery box. In the other hole, fit the blanking plate and pop in the 6mm countersunk screw. OK, now grab the big lid and line it up over the receiver with its vent towards the rear. Carefully fit the 4 small self-tappers. I say carefully as if your screwdriver isn't a good fit, it will strip them very easily. Tamiya suggests the use of metal tape to hold the antenna into the grooves inside the battery box, but I didn't see this as necessary. My antenna stays in quite nicely on its own, and with the battery in it won't be able to move much anyway. And that's that. On to the next. Step 31. Wheel arches. These are one of the best bits that makes the XV-01 stand out from a lot of the other chassis. So, of course, we'll be needing from the L parts tree, number 4 and number 5, the front arches, and number 8 and 9, the rear arches. And we also need the antenna tube, antenna cap, 4 8mm screws, and 4 8mm countersunk screws. We'll start with the front arches as they're the easiest to fit. Put one of the 8mm screws into one of the holes, line it up with the holes on the chassis and screw it in a couple of turns. Grab another screw, pop it into the other hole and do it up a couple of turns. Keep going between them until they're just bottomed out. Do the same thing with the other front arch. The rear arches are very slightly different. On the electronics bay side there's a lug that sticks out between the chassis and the suspension arm. You need to drop one of the countersunk screws into one of the holes, line up the arch and start the thread. Pop in the other screw and, well, you get the idea. The screws for the other rear arch go in through the top of the battery box, but the arch is fitted in much the same way. Pop a screw in, offer up the arch, and so on and so forth. When all 4 are fitted, it's time to sort out the antenna tube. The first thing to note is, in the manual they tell you to bend the antenna over the top of the tube and fit the cap. There's a note that says, BF2 is not required for 2.4 GHz receiver, but it can be easily missed. The older lower frequency receivers had a long antenna where the entire length is used. Most modern 2.4 gig receivers have a length of coax with only the last 2.5 centimeters being the actual antenna. So if you fold that over, you will be in effect halving the length of the antenna, which really isn't a good idea. I think they need to be a bit more clear in the manual, as I bet 90% of builders never read the notes. Anyway, if you haven't already, feed the antenna up through the mount, roughly measure the length against the antenna tube, cut the tube with a knife, slide it down over the antenna and pop the cap on. Nice and tidy. Step 32. Tyres and foams. For this you'll need the wheels, tyres and foam inserts. Start by removing the wheels from their sprues, which are dated 1992. Nice to see they're using the original mould that matches the body. Right, the inserts. Tamiya say in the manual to wrap the insert and glue the ends with some rubber cement. This will be just fine with the stock motor and might make them a little easier to fit, but if you end up wanting more speed and fit a brushless motor, the weight of the glue on one side will cause some pretty major vibrations, so we'll not be using the cement. Right, tuck the insert into the tyre, matching up the ends, then stretch the tyre, turn it a bit, stretch, turn it some more, stretch, and keep going until the insert is nice and even inside the tyre. Now the tricky bit. You need to feed a wheel into the tyre without disturbing the insert. The inserts are quite a tight fit in these tyres, so it's not as bad as it could be. Just keep an eye out. Of course, a car needs 4 of these, so you get to do 3 more. With a stock motor, you can almost get away without gluing the tyres onto the wheels. They will come adrift eventually though, so it's best to glue them on with some thin Sino. What we do is peel back the tyre from the bead at the top of the wheel and put a drop or 2 of Sino in. Then immediately squeeze the tyre while rotating it to help the Sino wick around the bead. Leave it glue side up for a couple of minutes so the glue can get a chance to get a good grip on the wheel. Then do the same routine on the inside bead. Peel back the tyre, drop in some glue and work it round. Again, leave it glue side up for a few minutes. Do that on all 4 and we are ready to continue. Step 33. Attaching the wheels and body posts. We need 4 8mm screws, 4 wheel nuts, which are just M4 flange nylocks, and from the NN parts tree we need 4 16s, wheel hexes, 2 number 3s, bearing inserts, 2 number 5 spacers, and from the B tree, the 2 B3 body mounts. There's also the 4 drive pins and bearings. We'll get the other bits for the front when we've done this lot to avoid any mix-ups. So, starting at the rear, pop an NN5 over the stub axle, then press an NN3 into the hub with the flange to the inside. Then pop a bearing in. Now, slot one of the drive pins into the hole in the stub axle and fit a hex over the top. Be careful that you don't lose the pin. When it's all nicely seated, pop a wheel over the top and follow it with a wheel nut. Do it up nice and tight. The tension will be on the spacer in the centre, so you can't actually overload the bearings. Of course, the other rear hub goes together in just the same way. The rear body mounts now. Slot one into the matching slot in the top of the damper tower, fitting it from the front. Then screw in one of the 8mm screws to hold it in place. Repeat on the other side and the rear is complete. Spin the chassis round and find the 2 front body posts, B2 and B4. These are sided, so keep track of which is which. You also need a pair of NN8 spacers. These go together in much the same way as the rear. Start by sliding the NN8 spacer over the stub axle, followed by a bearing. Then pop a drive pin through the hole. Slide a hex over that, make sure everything's nicely seated, and pop a wheel over the hex and pop on the wheel nut. Like the rear, the spacer will take up the load, so do the nut up nice and tight. Surprise, surprise, you need to do the same on the other front hub. Lastly, we need to fit one of the body posts, and just like the rear, slot one into its slot on the damper tower and pop in one of the 8mm screws. Do the same on the other side and we're done. Step 34. The front bumper. For this we will of course need the front bumper, as well as 4 8mm screws and 4 large washers. All we need to do is slide the bumper over the 4 posts, then pop a screw with a washer in each of the 4 holes in the ends of the posts. Do them up until they just about bottom out. I think that's the shortest step ever. Step 35. The battery cover. We need 2 8mm countersunk screws, 2 small O-rings and part K3, the cover. Pop one of the screws in from the bottom of the cover through the hole in one of the lugs. Then slide an O-ring over the thread. This is so when you remove the cover the screws stay put. Just do the same with the other lug as well. Flip the chassis over and assuming you're ready to test the car, plug a battery in and neatly fold up the wire and the plug and drop the battery into the tray. Slot the cover into its slots at the front of the chassis and close it. Keep an eye on the wires so you don't trap them. When it's closed, do up the 2 screws which thread into the 2 nylock nuts we fitted to the chassis earlier. If your battery is a bit loose in the tray, you can add some of the sticky backed foam to pad out the tray so it's nice and snug. You don't want it to be bouncing around in there. Step 36. If you're building with the Subaru shell, you've pretty much done. Bit of paint, drop the body on and you're good to go. The Lancia shell, however, has a couple of extra steps, but that's for next time. For now, let's just bask in the glory of a complete rolling chassis. Only a little play in the steering, quite acceptable. Smooth, supple suspension, looks very promising. But that's it for now. So this has been Nick at RC Mojo. Thanks for watching. I do hope you liked what you saw. If you did, a click on the like button would be greatly appreciated. Thanks everyone. Bye.